In this slideshow, we're going to talk about international trade theory. The traditional theory of international trade was called mercantilism. Under this theory, countries should export more than they import. The objective was to accumulate as much gold as possible, usually in the hands of the monarch. Under this theory, a trade surplus was a favorable balance of trade, and a trade deficit was an unfavorable balance of trade. Recently, we've seen the development of neo-mercantilism. Under this theory, you should export more than you import. The objectives are to achieve full employment or have political influence over some area of the economy. The first modern theory of international trade was the theory of absolute advantage, presented by Adam Smith in his book The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Under this theory, a nation's wealth is based on the goods and services available to consumers, not on gold in the hands of the monarch. Smith was the first consumer advocate. Smith showed that if countries move the resources into activities where they are more efficient, there will be more goods available for the same amount of work. Since our standard of living depends on the goods we can acquire for a given amount of work, then increasing our efficiency will raise our standard of living. A country may be more efficient at producing some product because it has some kind of advantage in that area. There are two kinds of advantage: natural advantage and acquired advantage. Let's look at an example of England and Portugal. Both countries produce cloth and wine. For the same amount of work, they can produce cloth, England 60 units, Portugal 30 units, and wine, England 10 units, and Portugal 80 units. So England is more efficient at producing cloth, and Portugal is more efficient at producing wine. Where do their advantages come from? England has a natural advantage for producing cloth because its climate is favorable for producing wool from sheep. England has an acquired advantage for producing cloth because it was the first country to use steam-powered machinery in the production of cloth. Portugal has a natural advantage for producing wine because its climate is favorable for growing grapes. Portugal has an acquired advantage for producing wine because a long time ago the Romans brought to Portugal the technology for making wine. If England shifts the resources it is using to produce wine into producing cloth, there will be more cloth available. And if Portugal shifts the resources it is using to produce cloth into producing wine, there will be more wine available. The results of this shift in resources will be production of cloth, England 120 units, production of wine, Portugal 160 units, more than they produced together before. So the English will have more cloth than they need, but no wine, and the Portuguese will have more wine than they need, but no cloth. What's the solution? They trade the cloth and wine, and consumers in both countries have more cloth and more wine for the same amount of work. Their standard of living has been raised. The next theory of international trade is called comparative advantage, presented by David Ricardo in 1817. And he addressed the question, what if a country could produce all products at an absolute advantage? Would it still benefit from trade? Well, within its borders, the country is more efficient at producing some products than it is at producing other products. Comparative advantage. So it will still gain by shifting resources into activities where it is more efficient. It will benefit by trading the products where it is more efficient for products where it is less efficient. The next theory of international trade is factor proportions theory, developed by Heckscher and Olin and presented in 1913. In this theory, there are two basic concepts: factor abundance and factor intensity. We'll explain these concepts with the example of Argentina and Switzerland. In Argentina, agricultural land is very abundant, so it is relatively inexpensive, whereas capital is very scarce, so it is relatively expensive. In Switzerland, agricultural land is very scarce, so it is relatively expensive, whereas capital is very abundant, so it is relatively inexpensive. Argentina has a competitive advantage in products that use land intensively. Producing beef makes very intensive use of land, so Argentina should produce and export beef. Switzerland has a competitive advantage in products that use capital intensively. Producing pharmaceuticals makes very intensive use of capital, so Switzerland should produce and export pharmaceuticals. A general conclusion we can draw from this example is a country has a competitive advantage in products that use intensively its abundant factors. The next theory of international trade is product life cycle theory. In this theory, there are 4 phases in the life of a product. Phase 1, its introduction. There's an innovation in response to an observed need. The innovating country begins to export to similar countries. Phase 2, growth. Exports increase, competition increases, and foreign production begins in developed countries. Phase 3, maturity. Exports from the innovating country decline. There's more product standardization. There's more competition. Foreign production begins in developing countries. Phase 4, decline. Production becomes concentrated in developing countries, and the innovating country becomes a net importer of the product. With globalization, there is more factor mobility. There are pressures for a country's abundant factors to move to countries where they are scarce. For example, the USA and Mexico. U.S. capital, which is abundant, moves to Mexico. Mexican labor, which is abundant there, moves to the U.S. Factors may move between countries because there are restrictions on trade. For example, the auto industry in the USA was protected by quotas on imports of cars from Japan, so capital moved from Japan to the USA to produce cars here. Capital has become more mobile. Labor is still less mobile, but in some activities, for example call centers, communications technology is overcoming this problem. Now take the quiz on this slideshow by clicking on the Quiz on Slideshow icon, which is right below the icon you clicked on to view this slideshow.